We are less than 24 hours from Hurricane Florence reaching the shore of the United States, and President Trump, he is still defending his response to the last major storm to hit U.S. territory. That, of course, is Hurricane Maria, which happened almost 1 year ago, devastating Puerto Rico. This morning, the president, he took to Twitter, tweeting, quote, 3,000 people did not die in the 2 hurricanes that hit Puerto Rico. When I left the island, after the storm had hit, they had anywhere from 6 to 18 deaths. As time went by, it did not go up by much. Then, a long time later, they started to report really large numbers, like 3,000. The president then blamed Democrats, who he said wanted to, quote, make me look bad as possible when I was successfully raising billions of dollars to help rebuild Puerto Rico. If a person died for any reason, like old age, just add them onto that list. Bad politics. I love Puerto Rico. We should explain that that number came out after researchers, not politicians, researchers, looked at the Puerto Rican population before and after the storm. Using historical models, they accounted for people that died of natural causes and for people that fled the island. That left them with an estimated 2,975 deaths that researchers now believe could have been linked to the storm. By the way, the report, as I mentioned, was not the work of Democrats. It was conducted by people from George Washington University, along with researchers at the Puerto Rico Graduate School of Public Health. Robert Costa is a national political reporter for The Washington Post and moderator of Washington Week on PBS. Bob, this blows my mind. I was in Puerto Rico less than 6 months ago. First of all, when the president says he's been raising billions of dollars to rebuild Puerto Rico, to me and the work I've done, that's an outright lie. Do you know of any evidence of President Trump raising billions of dollars to rebuild Puerto Rico?
There's no evidence of whatever he's saying on Twitter. And I've been asking people inside and outside of the White House on Capitol Hill, what is this all about, this Twitter storm this morning? And they say, what's new? That's what they've been texting back. And their point is he's isolated. There's the U.S. government, and the buck stops with President Trump, no doubt about that. But there's the U.S. government right now, they tell me, trying to handle this storm. And then there's a president of the United States watching cable news, responding to it on Twitter, and taking positions that the government, frankly, isn't taking anywhere else.
Okay, so are president's aides just hiding under the covers this morning? I mean, it's pure ignorance to say the day after the storm, when I was there, only 6 to 18 people died, not factoring in the regions without power for weeks, if not months. Once you don't have water, you have people drinking water from contaminated streams. The president could tip his hat saying, well, FEMA was handing out thousands of meals a day when they needed millions. There are no facts supporting what the president is saying. So who is watching him here and saying, right on, brother?
No one. There's a resignation inside of this West Wing and inside of the top echelons of the Republican Party that no one can actually push President Trump toward the reality of what's happening on the ground, and that he only sees things through the prism of himself. How does it affect his poll numbers? How does it affect his reputation? And because of that, advisors have mostly given up on trying to pull him back from these kind of outbursts.
Well, president's base might say, who cares about Puerto Rico, that island? They're our neighbor. I mean, I think of Rick Santorum yesterday calling Puerto Rico a country when it's laughable and humiliating for Rick Santorum to even say it's a country when we all know it's a U.S. territory. But from a popularity perspective, besides his core base, who's saying, well, it doesn't help me or my neighbors, who on earth hears President Trump say that and gets behind him? We know what happened. Even if you think about the thousands of people who fled Puerto Rico and moved to places like Florida, Texas, and New York, they might not have been able to vote for the president from Puerto Rico, but they certainly can when they live here.
They're Americans. They're also human beings. And there is a political cost here. If you think about the midterm elections just 2 months away, a government is evaluated, an administration is evaluated, not just how it handles a storm, but how it handles the message during the storm. Is the president showing empathy? Is he showing assertiveness in handling the situation? You have suburban voters across the country watching this very closely. The storm may not be hitting their home, but they're watching the president of the United States. And his approach, his leadership is going to be under scrutiny.
You can put suburban voters aside. What about Puerto Rican voters? What about the Hispanic vote who maybe didn't turn out to vote last time, who's going,
well, so many Puerto Ricans now live in Florida. key swing state. But the thing about Puerto Rico, too many people constantly make the mistake that Puerto Rico is somehow an island off there and it's not part of the United States. It is part of the United States. These are Americans. But beyond that, these are people. And the way they're kind of talked about as units or as things that are separate is just very odd and disturbing, Frank.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.